The topic of today's talk is social networks and emergence, and there's a kind of a funny translation issue that came up when I was looking at the English translation of the events today and of my speech in particular. The word emergence, which is the title of my second book, which I talked about a little bit last night, is a word that means, in a sense, a system where some higher level behavior or intelligence or pattern comes out of a lot of low level interaction between parts that aren't necessarily aware of the higher level form they're making. So in the city example, a neighborhood is often an emergent phenomenon of cities. No one, sometimes people do, but most of the time people don't deliberately plan neighborhoods. They just spontaneously emerge out of thousands or millions of individual decisions made by the residents of the city to live there or move there or hang out. And over time, a neighborhood with personality and some kind of endurance emerges out of all those local decisions. So I wrote a whole book about that, and in some sense I've been talking about issues around emergence for a very long time. There's a very similar English word, which is emergency, which means something totally different. And an emergency is, when your house is on fire, that's an emergency. You have to call the fire department. When there's a major crisis somewhere, that's an emergency. So I noticed that the English translation of my talk was social networks and emergency. I just wanted to make it clear that I was not planning on talking about emergencies, but in fact, I've decided to talk a little bit about emergencies. I'm going to talk about emergence and emergencies, just to show you how adaptable I am. We'll get to the emergencies right at the very end, but for the most part, we're going to talk about emergence. I wanted to start by going back in time a little bit, something I alluded to last night that I didn't talk about too much so I could save some of this material. Let's talk about an old-style urban social network, which is really central to my last book, The Invention of Air, and that is the 18th century coffee house, the 18th century British coffee house. You can see up here on the image here, this is a scene of some madness and bedlam. I don't think it was quite that chaotic. This was the Starbucks of the 18th century. And in fact, it turns out that the social networks that formed in the coffee houses of the 18th century literally changed the world. They had an immense impact on politics, on science, on religion, on businesses. People would hang out in these coffee shops, they would get together in these groups, they would hang out for 4 or 5 hours, and they were real kind of intellectual hubs where people from different backgrounds, who have different kind of fields of expertise, would hang out, wildly over-caffeinate themselves, and in that kind of crazed frenzy that you see right there, in part they invented the modern world. So many things that we now kind of take for granted that came out of that period have their roots somewhere in a coffee house. So the entire insurance business was largely, the whole idea of an insurance corporation was invented in Lloyd's Coffee House in London, which became Lloyd's of London, and still kind of perseveres to this day. In my book, there's a kind of momentous exchange between Joseph Priestley and Ben Franklin, who met at this coffee house called the London Coffee House, and Franklin had a group there called the Club of Honest Whigs, and they would get together every 2 weeks and hang out and talk about ideas, and just an amazing number of kind of innovations came out of that space. And I think that part of what we should be doing in thinking about social networks and thinking about emergent behavior and thinking about how these social networks map onto cities is to try and take some of that energy and some of that inventiveness that you see in systems like the 18th century coffee house and try and bring that online or recreate it in our urban spaces. That we want to build environments, may not look quite like that, but that have the same effect, that have the same kind of invigorating intellectual power that the 18th century coffee house had. I'll say one little anecdote here, which is relevant tangentially, which is another important thing about the 18th century coffee house is that they were drinking coffee. Because up until the 18th century, the daytime beverage of choice for both the mass and the elites in England and in most other countries of that period was alcohol. It was the safe choice to drink alcohol because the water wasn't safe to drink. And so because of the antibacterial properties of alcohol, people would wake up in the morning and they would have a little bit of beer, and then they would have a little bit of wine, and then particularly in the 1600s they would have gin in the afternoon, a little bit more wine. And so you had an entire population who was basically drunk all day long. And this was kind of par for the course. And when coffee and tea got introduced in the beginning of the 1700s and very quickly became affordable, they went from being a luxury item to kind of a staple of the diet in about 50 years, you in a sense had an entire culture that shifted from drinking all day to imbibing a stimulant, from basically taking a depressant to drinking a stimulant all day. And it's not surprising then that a great flowering of ideas happened shortly after they got off alcohol and moved to coffee. The Age of Enlightenment is almost certainly related to the switch from alcohol to caffeine as the drug of choice, right? Imagine what your lives would be like if you drank all day and then switched to coffee. You'd have better ideas, right? I know some of you do drink all day, and that's fine. But so the coffee house is bound up both in the physical space and in what they were actually drinking. But what you see in these spaces that's important to kind of translate over when we think about social networks is that social networks are a third place in that classic Oldenburg idea of it's not home and it's not work. It's a kind of border space between the very private and the official kind of work public space. And that is their power. And that's the opportunity, is to expand the kind of the realm of the third place in the virtual world, and maybe to connect it to physical, real-world third places like coffee shops in our cities. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about this in my personal history with social networks, which is I think relevant here. When Twitter first became, started to kind of cross over into the mainstream, I was promoting this last book, The Invention of Air, and I had been on Twitter for a while, and I started to use it a little bit more as an author in kind of a professional capacity, and it turned out that Twitter was a fantastic social network for that kind of thing, because you could get a relatively big audience. You could talk to them about what was going on your book tour. You can tell them about things that were happening if a review came out. You could build up a nice crowd for events if you were coming to a new town and things like that. So I was using it quite a bit. And I think at that point I was probably one of the better known authors who was really invested in Twitter as a platform. And so about a little more than a year ago, Twitter decided to create something called the Suggested User List. And this was a very, the list was a response to a problem that Twitter had and that all social networks have, which is that when you first join them, before you actually make friends or start following people, they are utterly useless, right? A social network, when you're not connected to anyone, is nothing. It's not a useful thing. You just have a blank screen, right? And so Twitter was trying to figure out a way to kind of, for people who are coming to the service for the first time, how do you create a kind of an on-ramp that will allow them to actually do something useful and quickly see the value of the service? And so they created a list of people that they thought would be interesting for you to follow. And I think it was initially a list of about 40 people or something like that. And they've added to it over time. So I think because I was doing interesting things as an author, they put me on this list. And it meant that every single person who signed up for Twitter was shown this list and would have the opportunity to check me and follow me. And that meant that over the next year, I accumulated 1.5 million followers on Twitter. So the size, basically, just a little smaller than the city of Curitiba I have following me on Twitter. And it was a very strange thing, because it went from a group of people who were really interested in my stuff, who were either friends or people who read my books, to just a mass audience of total strangers, most of whom had no idea who I was. And in fact, seemed to have no idea what Twitter was at all. So anytime I would tweet something, I would get a number of replies from people saying, "What are you? What is Twitter?" And then I would sometimes get angry tweets from people saying, why are you showing up in my feed?